I'm Mark Ramsey. I am so excited to have with me Jean Twenge. Jean is a psychologist, a researcher, and a professor at San Diego State University. Why Jean Twenge, you ask? Because Jean is the author of a terrific book just out in a brand new edition, and I'm very excited to read it. It's called Generation Me: Why Today's Young Americans Are More Confident, Assertive, Entitled, and More Miserable than ever before. Jean, that's a mouthful.
It is. We had a hard time coming up with that subtitle because there's so many interesting generational differences, and we had to try to fit them all in there.
Well, let's begin at the beginning here. Now, you've got a bunch of new data, but before we get into that, when we talk Generation Me, we're talking about people born in the 80s and 90s, correct?
That's right.
So we're talking generally about people who right now are maybe in their late teens, early 30s, somewhere in between there. So
that's right.
20-somethings especially into the 30s.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I've got to ask you the obvious question, the question on which your subtitle is based, which is, why are these folks more confident, assertive, and entitled? I'll leave miserable aside.
Okay.
What about confident, assertive, and entitled?
Yeah. It really all comes back to the cultural shift toward individualism and focus on the self. If you think about your grandparents' lives, for most of us, it's going to be earlier in the 20th century. They were much more focused on the rules that they were supposed to follow, whether that was rules around gender or marriage or sexuality, any of these things. That was what dictated their lives. And they didn't think quite as much about their individual rights and what they wanted in terms of their individual freedom. And our culture now places a lot more emphasis on those things. So what has really happened, especially for this generation, Generation Me, or the Millennials, is they grew up during a time that was not only individualistic and self-focused, but really took it to this next level of not only are you going to have individual rights and individual freedom, which the baby boomers really pioneered in the 60s and 70s, but we're going to say everybody should have high self-esteem. Everybody should feel good about themselves. Everyone should be self-confident. So this led to, among other things, the idea that everybody who plays, every kid who plays in a sports game should get a trophy. Whether they win or lose or sit on the bench, they get a trophy.
I remember that. I competed. I'm not Generation Me, but I remember competing in a swim meet, and I got a ribbon, a third-place ribbon. And then people said, well, how many people competed? I said, well, 3. So talk to me. Now, these are not the folks we would describe as digital natives, or are they?
They are. So there's a lot of overlap. So when people think about generational differences, when they think about this group born in the 80s and 90s, it's often the first thing that they think of is the technology. And that this is the generation that grew up with cell phones and social networking and so on. And, I think those are important shifts. However, as a researcher and a psychologist, I'm more interested in what are their values? What are their personality traits? How has this shaped the way they have used this technology?
Right.
I think that's always a little interesting thought experiment. If our grandparents had this technology, what would they have done with it? It might be something different from what this generation has done with it. And the joke I sometimes make is if we had cell phone cameras, back in the 50s, I shouldn't say I wasn't born then. But if they did have them back in the 50s, maybe they would have used them to take pictures of other people. Instead of now, the idea is to take pictures of yourself in a selfie.
Yeah, absolutely. So based on what you've learned, obviously my space is the media space. And you talked about how those values relate to how they use technology and how they use media. You didn't say that, but that's certainly related
Absolutely.
to technology usage. Talk to me about that. Based on what you've learned, how are these people different when it comes to media? I recognize that there's lots more choices and it's much more personalizable. That's obvious. But what else?
Yeah, well, I think the personalization is actually really key, and it really fits the psychological profile of this group. So they do want everything to be individualized and personalized. And just as a quick aside, my colleagues and I actually did a Google Books analysis. You can look up words and phrases and how much they've been used. The words personalized and personalized quadrupled, I think, between the 1960 and the present. So that's something that people didn't used to think about that very much. And now that's at the forefront. So that's the only world that this generation really has ever known. So in terms of media, they come from that point of individualism and self-focus, where they want to know, okay, what can I get that is specific to me? How is this relevant to me? And then perhaps because of the technology, there's also some impatience there too. I not only want it to be for me, but I want it now.
So what lesson then is there in that for those of us who work in my space, is the audio space, especially the radio space, where we've got a one-to-many product primarily? It's not a personalized product to a large degree. I mean, what are the implications for people who traffic in that space when they're trying to serve this audience?
Yeah, it's a little a little bit of a challenge, as you know. Anything that can be done to make radio more on demand and more personalized will attract this group. So, for example, the many radio stations putting their content online, so you can click on it on the computer, and then it'd be even better, of course, if you could pause it and fast forward and listen to it when you want to listen to it, in the way, say, you can do with television. And so some radio stations have done that. And I think those that can, personalize and allow people to listen when they want to listen, will reach this group.
And you're not just saying put your content online. You're really saying think through the problem from the perspective of people who want things personalized and want an experience that can be interactive for them. And when you take your content that lives in one medium that's one-to-many and apply it towards another medium that's, one-to-one, essentially, rethink all the rules.
Yeah, and I think that interactivity is another really big point. That's something this generation's really gotten used to. It fits the psychological profile as well, and their experience with technology, that they are used to participating. So anything that radio can do to help them participate, to be interactive, and there are ways to do this that are more and less effective. So a less effective way, you have a little interactive game on your site. But if you have something where users can contribute some content, like there's some stations that, it used to be people would call in for a request. Now it's a similar thing. Maybe even have somebody, tell a few jokes or play things on the air that the users have generated. There's this trend in advertising too of user-generated content, and that happened very recently, and it's the most popular, among this generational group, which I don't think is a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I've argued to people before is that in this space where so much can be personalized and interactive, one of the things that a radio broadcaster can do that others can't necessarily do is have that hit content, that content that's bigger than personalized, that unique, compelling hit thing that appeals to a lot of people at the same time that can't be personalized because it's a human being, for example, and a morning show, a Howard Stern, something like that defies personalization because it's bigger than that. What is the role for that kind of content with this kind of generation?
Yeah, there's certainly still a role for that. There are certainly still going to be, radio hosts who are going to catch on, and people who start trends. I'm not saying that we don't have any herd instinct among this group. Of course we do, and they're young, which contributes to that as well. It's just like all media, it's become much more atomized. When you have popular hosts, for example, you're not getting as large a percentage of the market as you might have before. Right. And the same is true for TV and lots of other media.
Is it safe to say that if you're in the radio space, that you're no longer only in the radio space, that consumers, Generation Me, they're not drawing lines between media, billboards, television, radio, that the world of those small number of media no longer exists, and now it's more of a spectrum, and they expect things to live in different forms across transmedia, so to speak? Yeah,
they do. Although their first choice is for everything to be online, and for everything to be interactive, and for everything to be on demand, so they can go find it when they want to find it. I think that's the real theme across all these different types of media.
You're getting to a point. A lot of people in the radio space argue, well, maybe it's that these people haven't grown into the habit yet. You know, they'll get older and they'll want to listen to the news talk station. They'll get older, they'll want to listen to the classic hit station or whatever. And you're saying don't count on it, right?
I basically am. And this gets to, another broader, really interesting question, which is these differences that we're talking about when I'm talking about the millennials or Generation Me. Do they occur just because they're young, because they're in their 20s, or is this a true generational shift? So from the very beginning, when I was doing this research, starting out 20 years ago, I wanted to make really, really sure I answered that question. So when I'm referring to these generational differences in terms of individualism and personalization and so on, these come from studies done of Generation Me compared to Gen Xers and Boomers at the same age. Now, people do change as they get older. They do, get into more habits. They might listen to the news more. However, the generational shifts tend to be stronger. So, given the individualism, given some other data on civic engagement, lack of interest in politics, and these things among Generation Me, that would be my conclusion, is not to count on them getting more interested in the news. For example, as they get older, my best prediction would be that that's not going to occur. That they're not going to end up being as interested in the news as Boomers or Gen Xers were in their 40s once Gen Me reaches their 40s. They are definitely interested in celebrity and entertainment stuff. If you look at kind of interest in fame, interest in celebrities, all of those have grown over the generations.
You have a new version of the book that just came out. The book, again, is called Generation Me. I'll stick with the title, not the subtitle. And I'm interested in what the new data tells you. I mean, based on, you took a fresh look at the data, you added in new data sets. What is the kind of newest, latest, and greatest insight that are packed into that book?
Yeah, so, a lot of it some of it wasn't updating the technology, because when the first edition of the book came out, it was 2006. So Facebook was still on college campuses. YouTube had just come out. Twitter, I think, didn't even exist. So the media landscape is very, very different now. So I did some new interviews, and I looked at some of the new research on the effect of all of this media. There's some very interesting stuff about social networking sites and personality as just one example. People who score high in narcissism, which is an extreme focus on the self, which is higher among this generation, tend to have more friends on Facebook. And about 4 or 5 studies have found this now. So it suggests that this individualism, even the extreme individualism, is a really good fit for this new media climate, at least as people are using it now. There's new data on religious belief and practice, on sexuality, and what I was most excited about is workplace attitudes. So that was something that there wasn't much data on previously, but I teamed up with some business colleagues, and we did what's, to my knowledge anyway, the first study of generational differences in work attitudes based on an over time national representative sample. So kind of the best data that you can get, take age out of the equation and say, what attitudes do Boomers and Gen Xers and Gen Me have toward work? And what we found by far the largest generational difference was in the desire for work-life balance. Gen Me, the millennials, were much more likely to say they wanted a job with a lot of vacation. They were less willing to work overtime. They wanted more balance compared to the Gen Xers and the Boomers at the same age. That was the biggest difference. Contrary to some reports, there weren't very many generational differences in wanting a job to help others or wanting a job that was interesting. And there was a little bit of an increase in wanting a job with money and status. But that work-life balance piece was one of the biggest.
So just not to get too deep into it, but in terms of the religion issue, can you reveal anything based on what you've digested so far of what the latest data tells you there?
Overall, there is a decline in the percentage of people who affiliate with religion, and we're starting to see declines in religious belief and practice as well. So there was some speculation that these changes were just around people joining churches, but we have these early indications that that's not the case. Now, the majority of Americans are still religious, but there is a growing secular minority.
Interesting. So don't expect that Generation Me is going to grow into a news talk station anytime soon, is one of your final points.
Yeah, although, well, I think it of course, depends on the format. If
Absolutely.
Because if news talk is going to go the direction that, for example, TV news has gone, in other words, toward a little more coverage or a lot more of celebrity news and entertainment and kind of the Huffington Post style of stuff that's here, it's relevant to your life, and here's how you can have a better life and so on. Push in that direction, and perhaps away from some of the stuff around politics, you might have more success. So another set of data that might be relevant here. Trust in other people is at an all-time low. And confidence in institutions, including, sadly, the media, but also universities, the government, even medicine, has also really declined in recent years, which was that was actually one of the surprising results. You'd asked about that earlier. I thought that would be really low in the early 90s, and sure enough, it was, because it was a time there was a lot of crime and things going on, a lot of bad social indicators. Now we don't have that, and the economy is coming back, but this is a time of really low trust, and people are very cynical. And I think that's another thing to understand about this generation. Yes, they're optimistic about their own prospects, but in terms of how they see others and these institutions, they're not as optimistic, and they're not very trusting.
Sounds a little narcissistic to me. Jean Twenge is a psychologist, a researcher, and a professor at San Diego State University. She's the author of the new version of a book that's been out for a while, but with new data in it now, in bookstores now, called Generation Me: Why Today's Young Americans Are More Confident, Assertive, Entitled, and More Miserable Than Ever Before. Jean, thank you so much.
Thank you.